What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down with a host who mistakes cynicism for cleverness? What happens when decades of earned wisdom meets manufactured controversy designed for social media clips? Tonight we dive into one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history, when Denzel Washington walked into what should have been a celebration of his legendary career, and instead found himself facing a host determined to tear down everything he represented. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us what you think about what you're about to witness. Your engagement helps us bring you more stories like this one that expose the truth behind Hollywood's biggest moments. The green room backstage felt different that evening, charged with an energy that the veteran staff could not quite identify. Denzel Washington sat in the leather armchair with the same composed presence that had commanded movie screens for over 4 decades. At 69, the two-time Academy Award winner carried himself with a dignity that seemed to belong to a different era, when respect was earned through craft and character rather than controversy and chaos. His publicist had assured him this would be a straightforward promotional appearance, the kind of respectful conversation that honored both his recent work and his legendary career. The show's producer, a woman who had worked in television for nearly 2 decades, approached him with what appeared to be genuine admiration. She had grown up watching his films, had seen him transform from promising young actor to cultural icon, and she seemed honored to facilitate what should have been a meaningful conversation about his journey and his latest project. But there were undercurrents in the production that she was not privy to, conversations happening in executive offices, and private meetings that had shaped tonight's agenda in ways that contradicted everything she believed the interview would represent. The host had made it clear to his inner circle that he was tired of what he called softball interviews with aging stars, and he had specifically requested that tonight's conversation push boundaries that previous hosts had respected. On stage, the host was working the crowd with his usual blend of topical humor and self-deprecating charm, but those who knew him well could sense something different in his energy. There was an edge to his jokes, a sharpness that suggested he was building toward something bigger than his typical celebrity chat. The audience responded enthusiastically, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge their understanding of what late-night entertainment should represent. The commercial break announcement triggered the familiar backstage choreography of a live television production. Sound engineers made final adjustments to microphone levels, camera operators confirmed their angles, and production assistants scurried between departments with the focused energy that kept complex shows running smoothly. But amid all this professional activity, there was an underlying tension that seemed to emanate from the host's immediate team, a sense that tonight's show would be different from what anyone expected. Washington rose from his chair with the fluid grace that had made him compelling to watch in countless film roles. His attire was characteristically elegant but understated, a perfectly tailored dark suit that spoke to his preference for classic style over trendy fashion statements. The producer who escorted him toward the stage seemed increasingly nervous, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease that she could not fully articulate but felt in her bones. As they walked through the narrow corridors that connected the green room to the main stage, Washington's mind was focused on the message he hoped to convey during the interview. He had stories to tell about his craft, insights to share about the industry he had helped shape, and perspectives on the responsibility that came with the platform his success had provided. He believed, as he always had, that fame was a tool that should be used thoughtfully and purposefully. The host's introduction was effusive in a way that somehow managed to sound both complimentary and condescending, emphasizing Washington's age and long career in language that felt more like a retirement tribute than a celebration of ongoing excellence. As Washington walked onto the stage, the applause was warm and genuine, reflecting the deep respect that audiences held for a man who had consistently delivered powerful performances while maintaining his dignity and integrity throughout his career. The opening moments of the interview followed familiar patterns, with Washington responding to questions about his latest project with the thoughtful precision that had always characterized his public appearances. He spoke about his work with genuine passion, describing the creative process and the collaborative nature of filmmaking in ways that illuminated both his expertise and his continued enthusiasm for his craft. His answers were substantive and engaging, exactly what audiences had come to expect from one of cinema's great actors. But the host seemed impatient with Washington's measured responses, frequently interrupting with comments that felt designed to diminish rather than enhance what the actor was sharing. Each interruption was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but collectively they created a pattern that began to shift the conversation away from celebration toward something more confrontational. The audience initially missed these subtle provocations, but the atmosphere in the studio was beginning to change in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. The first clear sign of trouble came when the host's questions began to veer away from Washington's work toward more personal territory, framed in language that suggested controversy where none existed. What had started as a discussion about artistic choices suddenly became something else entirely, something that made Washington's expression tighten almost imperceptibly as he began to understand that this was not the respectful conversation he had been promised. Washington's responses remained dignified and thoughtful, but there was a new edge to his voice that those familiar with his work recognized as a warning sign. Denzel Washington was not someone who lost his composure easily, but he was also not someone who would sit quietly while being disrespected on national television. The host, however, seemed to interpret Washington's restraint as weakness rather than strength, and he pressed forward with increasing boldness. The audience began to sense that something was not quite right as the tone of the conversation grew more adversarial. What they had expected to be an engaging discussion with one of their favorite actors was becoming something uncomfortable, something that made them question why they were being asked to witness what felt increasingly like a deliberate attempt to diminish a man they had come to respect and admire over decades of excellent work. The host's true intentions became unmistakable as his questions grew more pointed and personal, crossing lines that previous interviewers had respected out of basic professional courtesy. What had been presented to Washington as an opportunity to discuss his craft and career was revealing itself to be something far more sinister, an ambush designed to generate viral moments at the expense of a man who had spent decades earning the respect he was now watching being systematically undermined. Washington's legendary composure began to show signs of strain as the host's behavior became increasingly disrespectful. The actor's responses remained measured and dignified, but there was a new intensity in his eyes that those who knew him well would have recognized as a signal that his patience was reaching its limit. He had not built a 4-decade career by allowing himself to be manipulated or disrespected, and he was beginning to understand that he was facing someone who had no appreciation for the values that had guided his professional and personal life. The breaking point approached when the host made a comment that was clearly designed to provoke rather than inform, a statement that revealed his complete lack of understanding about what Washington represented to audiences and to the industry as a whole. The studio fell silent for a moment as the words hung in the air, the audience collectively processing what they had just heard and beginning to understand that they were witnessing something that went far beyond typical celebrity interview dynamics. Washington's response was swift and devastating in its precision. Without raising his voice or resorting to personal attacks, he delivered a rebuke that cut straight to the heart of what was wrong with the host's approach. His words carried the weight of someone who had earned his place in American culture through talent, hard work, and integrity, and who would not stand by while those values were mocked for the sake of cheap entertainment. The contrast between Washington's genuine authority and the host's manufactured provocations was stark and undeniable. The host's reaction revealed everything about his character and his intentions. Instead of acknowledging that he had crossed a line or showing any recognition of Washington's legitimate concerns, he doubled down on his disrespectful approach. His response was calculated to make Washington appear unreasonable while positioning himself as the victim of an allegedly oversensitive guest. But his manipulation was transparent to anyone paying attention, and the audience's response was tellingly muted. What followed was a masterclass in the difference between earned respect and manufactured celebrity. Washington did not need to resort to theatrics or cheap shots to make his point. His mere presence and the power of his convictions were enough to expose the hollowness of the host's approach. Every attempt the host made to regain control of the narrative only served to highlight the vast gulf between someone who had built a career on excellence and someone who seemed to believe that tearing others down was a legitimate form of entertainment. The host's desperation became increasingly apparent as he realized that his carefully planned ambush was backfiring spectacularly. His questions became more aggressive, his interruptions more frequent, and his attempts to frame Washington's responses in negative terms more obvious and desperate. He had wanted to create a moment that would generate headlines and social media buzz, but instead he was creating a moment that exposed his own lack of professionalism and basic human decency. Washington's patience, legendary though it was, finally reached its breaking point when the host made another disparaging comment that crossed every line of professional and personal respect. The actor's response was measured but final, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from decades of experience dealing with people who mistake cynicism for intelligence and provocation for insight. His words carried a finality that made it clear the conversation had reached a point where meaningful dialogue was no longer possible. The production team found themselves in an impossible situation as their headsets crackled with confused instructions. From the control room, executives who had approved this confrontational approach were now watching it implode in real time, creating the kind of public relations disaster that could damage relationships throughout the industry. The host's behavior was generating exactly the wrong kind of attention, making him look petty and unprofessional rather than clever and provocative. The host's final attempt to maintain control was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire encounter. His words, intended to sound dismissive and superior, instead came across as desperate and small. He had wanted to appear powerful and relevant by challenging a respected figure, but instead he had succeeded only in demonstrating his own inadequacy and lack of understanding about what true authority looks like. The audience's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The scattered, nervous laughter that had greeted some of the host's earlier provocations was replaced by an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about their growing disapproval of what they were witnessing. These were people who had come to see one of their heroes and instead found themselves watching someone attempt to tear down a man who represented everything they admired about dedication, excellence, and dignity. Security personnel appeared at the edge of the stage, though their presence only served to highlight how completely the host had lost control of his own show. Washington needed no protection from the consequences of standing up for himself. He needed protection from a host who had revealed himself to be unworthy of sharing a stage with someone who had spent decades earning the respect that was now being so casually dismissed. The moment of truth arrived when Washington made his decision clear through actions that spoke louder than any words could have. Rising from his chair with the same commanding presence that had made him one of cinema's greatest leading men, he removed his microphone and placed it deliberately on the desk between them. The gesture was simple but profound, a clear statement that he would not participate in any further degradation of the values he had spent a lifetime upholding. The host's desperation reached its peak as he realized he was losing control of the situation he had created. His attempts to frame Washington's departure as an overreaction only served to highlight his own unprofessional conduct and complete lack of understanding about what he had just witnessed. Every word he spoke in those final moments revealed someone so disconnected from basic concepts of respect and dignity that he could not comprehend why anyone would object to being treated as material for cheap entertainment. Washington's exit was a masterclass in maintaining grace under the most trying circumstances. He did not storm off in anger or resort to the kind of dramatic gestures that would have given the host material for future mockery. Instead, he simply refused to participate further in what had become a travesty of meaningful discourse. His measured pace as he walked toward the exit spoke to a man who was disappointed but not surprised by what he had encountered. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as Washington reached the edge of the stage. The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when authentic dignity triumphed over manufactured controversy, and genuine class proved more powerful than cynical provocation. The host sat alone at his desk, his carefully constructed persona in ruins, while the cameras continued to capture his professional humiliation. Washington paused at the exit, turning back to deliver a final comment that encapsulated everything that had just occurred with the kind of precision that had made him a master of his craft. His words were measured and powerful, cutting through the artificial atmosphere of the studio like a declaration of principles that could not be compromised for anyone's entertainment. He did not need to raise his voice or resort to personal attacks. The power of his conviction and the righteousness of his position spoke for themselves. The host's final response was perhaps the most damning moment of the entire encounter. His words revealed someone so consumed with generating content and maintaining relevance that he could not understand why anyone would prioritize personal dignity over entertainment value. The contrast between his shallow opportunism and Washington's deep commitment to principles that transcended show business was stark and undeniable. As Washington disappeared behind the curtain, the studio remained trapped in an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The host attempted to recover with a joke, but his words fell flat in the uncomfortable atmosphere he had created. The audience's response was telling in its absence, their silence speaking louder than any applause could have about their feelings toward what they had just witnessed. The production team scrambled to salvage what remained of the show, but the damage was already done. The host had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person that audiences were growing tired of seeing in positions of influence, someone who treated genuine accomplishment as a target for mockery and authentic dignity, as something to be exploited for cheap laughs. His behavior had backfired so completely that he had inadvertently created a moment that would define him in the worst possible way. The credits rolled over a scene of uncomfortable aftermath, with the host sitting alone at his desk while the audience filed out in subdued groups, discussing what they had just witnessed with voices that carried disappointment and disbelief. The contrast could not have been more stark between the man who had walked away with his integrity intact and enhanced, and the one who remained behind, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. Somewhere beyond the studio walls, Washington was already moving forward, his commitment to excellence and dignity unchanged by his encounter with someone who clearly did not understand the difference between entertainment and exploitation. The host, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of behavior that had revealed his true character to a national audience in the most unflattering possible light. The final image that lingered was not of conflict or confrontation, but of the profound difference between someone who had earned respect through decades of excellence and someone who seemed to believe that respect could be gained by tearing others down. It was a lesson in the power of authentic dignity and the ultimate futility of trying to diminish someone whose stature was built on substance rather than manufactured celebrity. What do you think about Denzel Washington's decision to walk away, rather than continue participating in this kind of treatment? Should respected veterans of the entertainment industry be subjected to this type of confrontational interviewing, or do they deserve better treatment based on their contributions to the industry? Share your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories about the moments when Hollywood's biggest stars refused to compromise their principles for anyone's entertainment.